morning, Madam Chair, Mr. Chair. My name is Rich Desmond. I'm the CHP's legislative liaison, and I want to thank you also on behalf of Commissioner Farrow and the Highway Patrol for continuing to include us in the dialogue. And I also want to thank the staff for the discussions we've had leading up to this committee hearing. I know we talked about our role at length during the last hearing, and the background document reiterates a lot of what our role is, our formal role. It's simple. The Highway Patrol is charged with investigating all crimes that occur on state property in California, pursuant to our authority in the government code. Also, consistent with that, every state agency is required to report to the CHP when a crime has been committed on state property or involves a state asset. Now, cybercrime is really no different than any other crime when it comes to our responsibility and that reporting requirement. And I believe Department of Technology is going to talk a little bit about the reporting requirement and what they're doing a little later. What is different with cybersecurity is the efforts it takes on a collaborative level with our state partners, local partners, and federal partners, and how we have to leverage some of these collaborative relationships in dealing with what is inherently a multi-jurisdictional type crime. Chair Chow, you discussed some of the threats we're facing now, and so Chief Scott Howland is here with me to discuss that in detail, some of the trends we're seeing, some of the threats we are seeing, and Chief Howland has the best perspective about that, because not only is he the Highway Patrol's Chief Information Officer, he also is the commander over our division that oversees our computer crimes investigators. And so with that, to talk about the more technical details, I'll turn it over to Chief Howland.
Thank you. Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Scott Howland, Chief of Information Management Division with the California Highway Patrol. And as Rich said, I kind of have a dual perspective, because I see it from the law enforcement side as far as investigating cyber crimes for state entities, and also from the CIO side of making sure that our department is secure as far as our IT infrastructure goes. And it's interesting as we look at cybersecurity, and I think the committee's done a great job talking about how it's a changing landscape. And our threat keeps changing, and it's really keeping an eye on that and seeing what the current threats are and what we need to do to mitigate those and address those threats. We as a first responder, as Rich said, we investigate those crimes that occur on state departments across the state, and we've also developed partnerships with many different partners. We have a close partnership with the Department of Justice as far as doing criminal investigations. We work closely with the FBI. My computer crimes unit is cross-sworn federally. That gives us, and have top secret clearances, that gives us access to the best information as far as cybercrime goes. We also work in partnership with the FBI because, as we know, a lot of cyber crimes don't happen locally. They happen in other states, other parts of the world, which is the challenge from it. Because when you look at our bread and butter from the Highway Patrol standpoint of traffic collisions, at one point you have both parties at the same location. But with cyber, we've got folks that could be anywhere in the world, attacking anywhere else in the world, which adds some additional challenges to it. From the reporting standpoint, we've tried to make it as easy as possible for state departments to report security incidents. And our process is a phone call to our emergency notification and tactical alert center. One phone call takes care of the notification to my computer crimes unit, so if there's a crime involved, we can investigate it. It also takes care of the initial notification to the Information Security Office under the Department of Technology. That way, it makes the process easy for state departments to report. And as we look at our reliance on technology, just think of the explosion of the number of users, the number of phones, the amount of data, the number of devices connected to IP networks, the amount of network traffic. That's consistent across the globe, and very consistent with state agencies as our reliance goes, which talks about the importance of this topic. But I want to start with a global perspective, because cybercrime is global. It's not just limited to the state. And I think as I share some stats, I grabbed some industry reports. I looked at the Verizon data breach report, FireEye report, Palo Alto Network reports. It seems like every company's got their report, but a lot of the data is very, very consistent. And I'll give you a couple examples. Out of the Verizon data breach report, 29% of breaches were due to miscellaneous errors. Human error, 29%. Crimeware accounted for 25%. Insider misuse, 20%. Physical loss, 15%. We're going to hear those numbers again. A couple things I want to talk about as we look at our threat, because it's important to understand what our threat is so that we can appropriately respond to it. You kicked off the hearing talking about ransomware. That's just one type of crimeware that we are seeing. Think about phishing. Email accounts for at least 40+% of our threat. Phishing are these emails you get that sometimes look legit, sometimes don't look legit, trying to get you to click on a link and log into an account. That account might be your bank account. It might be a shopping account. It might be something else. That link doesn't take you to your account. It takes you to their website to steal your credentials. They then gain access of it. A disturbing trend we're seeing is 78% of those phishing emails come from the IT department. Think about that. If it's the IT department sending you an email saying reset your password or put in your credentials, what are those credentials for? Your network. They then get into your network and then go from there. Very, very dangerous stuff. Spear phishing, another thing you have to be very, very careful of. Our criminals are very sophisticated. They'll take a look at your social profile on net, develop some specific information about you, and craft an email specifically for you, trying to get your credentials. Again, ultimately trying to take over your accounts, get into your network, and put malware software on there. So how do you address these things? And you look at what technology can do. Technology can take care of some of it. Technology can block emails that they identify with malicious software as far as phishing emails if we're able to identify it. Unfortunately, it's not 100%, and that introduces the people part of it. Some stats for you to put the people part in perspective. Recent study showed that 23% of recipients open phishing emails, and 11% click on the attachment. And when you think about how those phishing campaigns work, they send out a whole lot of email and hope they have a few clickers. That's how they gain access. How long does it take for a typical phishing email to be successful? 50% are opened within an hour and clicked on the link when they do. Doesn't take very much time. I love a quote from Lance Spitzer, who's the training director of the SANS Institute. He says this: "One of the most effective ways you can minimize the phishing threat is through effective awareness and training. Not only can you reduce the number of people that fall victim to potentially less than 5%, you're creating a network of human sensors that are more effective at detecting phishing attacks than almost any technology." And that's where information sharing is critical from the standpoint. Technology does a great job with it. And I'll give you an example. Phishing email comes out, identify it has malicious software in it. By sharing that information, we can then look at our state email. We can then pull that email back because typically it's not just one recipient who gets it. It's multiple recipients. And I'll use an example from our department. I had an employee identify a potentially malicious email. We looked at it, looked in our system, and pulled it back from 12 mailboxes before someone had an opportunity to click on it. That information sharing is critical because that's how we beat them. Because if they don't have the opportunity to click, that 11% that would click on that link aren't going to have the opportunity. Another huge threat is still malware, malicious software placed on our computers. Globally, when you look at it, there's about 170 million malware attempts for 2015. If you do simple math, that's 5 a second. That's a lot of malware out there trying to get into our systems. And the top malwares do things like command and control botnet membership, credential theft, fraud, click-farm, Bitcoin, ransomware. The list goes on as far as what they do. How many of you have heard the statement, if you're careful of what websites you go to, you should be pretty good? We've all heard that statement, haven't we? Unfortunately, that statement's no longer true. Because you look at one of the trends out there, malvertising. Everybody heard of malvertising? Basically what this is when you go to your website, you probably check a news website every morning. You go to that website, you check on it, and around all the news stories are what? Advertising. And a lot of the big websites are using third-party advertisers. And what happens is they then put out the advertisers. Well, the criminals are then paying for advertising to get into websites. So what happens is your web browser actually connects to multiple web browsers out there. And unfortunately, some of those web browsers deliver malicious content. The challenge is you don't know all that stuff is happening in their background. And it's amazing of the numbers there. So you look at that threat we have out there. So what's really happening as far as the state goes? As far as what we're experiencing as our particular threats for state departments. As I said before, my computer crimes investigation unit investigates these incidents when there's a potential crime involved, and I'll give you a picture of things. So when we look at the reports that were initiated, about 905 Caesar reports from the year 2015, and the breakdown for California was about 30% were lost and stolen equipment. 30% was the loss of personal identifying information, and unfortunately, as was mentioned earlier, a lot of that is human error. Sent an email to the wrong person, posted information that shouldn't have been posted. Human error. 25% was attributed to crimeware, and 15% was identified as misuse or unauthorized access. Those numbers sound pretty familiar because they're very, very close to what the national numbers are. As far as particular cases, my computer crimes unit will look at those reports, and then they'll identify cases that look like there's criminal conduct and then perform an investigation. We looked at my unit performed about 197 cases for the year 2015. Of those, about 35% were generated from state departments initiating a Caesar report. Of those, about 54% dealt with crimeware or hacking. About 11% dealt with theft or loss, and many of the lost items are investigated by other agencies. And I'll give you an example. State employee parks their car, the car gets broken into, and a state laptop gets stolen. Depending on where that crime occurs, it may be a different jurisdiction that investigates that. May or may not be the CHP that actually investigates that particular loss. Unauthorized misuse accounted for about 35%, and then our unit also provided a lot of case assistance in other criminal cases, as well as for other law enforcement agencies with that. But I think an important trend, and Chair Chow, I appreciated you mentioning, we also want to know the successes. And an important trend that we've discovered in a lot of our cases is our systems are actually working. Because when we look at the malware incidents that we've had, most of those have been limited to very few machines. And most of those have been detected by our systems, which gives us the opportunity to limit the impact of it, address those, clean them up, and get everything back in line from that standpoint. I think the other part that is important to understand that most experts say that between 85 and 90% of targeted attacks are very preventable. And a lot of that goes back to making sure we address our application vulnerabilities and things that can be patched. So what are we doing as a CHP to make sure we're prepared for the future? We're doing a couple things. One is we're trying to stay current with our technology and training, because technology is always changing, and I got to make sure my investigators are up to date on the latest so that we can investigate those crimes. We're also investing to make sure they have the equipment they need to perform their jobs in that. And then I think the most critical thing is the information sharing component. Because again, it's that information that's shared amongst not only law enforcement, but our partners. Sharing that information with the Department of Technology, sharing that information with OES, the National Guard, DOJ. And then the other part of it, too, is some of these crimes, unfortunately, are a huge challenge to investigate. And just because we don't solve one, it doesn't mean it's fruitless, because we also share on a national level information regarding our cases to ensure that as other cases that are similar, that have other pieces of the puzzle, we can connect the dots. And it's amazing how you identify, we think it's coming from this IP address, or we have this trend, and then you find a couple other cases and you get additional pieces of information. We've been successful in solving some crimes that way with it. And so that information and collaboration is very, very important. And I think the other perspective I want to mention, and I'll close with a couple more comments here because I know we're short on time, from the Chief Information Officer side. I think it's really important, and I think having the concept of we want to protect what we have, we want to detect to make sure we can identify any threats or anything that does make it into our systems as quickly as possible. What that allows us to do is minimize the risk, because if we can stop it quickly at one machine, we don't have a whole network that's compromised. Also need to make sure we respond. And with that, when we talk about response, it's important to have that at different levels. One is a department response of whoever's impacted, because internally you have things you need to do as a department. The other part is on a bigger scale of having our coordination done, and we work very closely with our partners to ensure that we're able to do that. And I think when you look at emergency response, it's something our department's very, very good at. And you look at law enforcement in general across the state of California, we have a lot of experience with that. When a incident occurs that exceeds our scale, what do? We call mutual aid and ask our law enforcement partners to come and help. We as the CHP have a lot of resources out there we can tap into. I've got my team that does my primary work. I also have some investigators across the state that are specially trained that I can call in at any time to help with that work. I've also got 5 high-tech task forces across the state that I can tap into. I've got my partners at DOJ E-Crimes that we work very closely with. As a matter of fact, we're co-housed with them on that. We also have the OES that helps coordinate on a larger scale from the standpoint of additional resources needed for investigations. I've got the National Guard and so the FBI that we work closely with. And so we're able to scale to the size of whatever the event is. And then I think the other part of the response is, and this really happens at a individual department level, is really looking at how did they gain access to my system? How did they maintain access? Because typically if it turns into a bigger thing, they were in there for a while. What data was stolen? And then most importantly, have I contained it and stopped the bleeding? Because it's very, very crucial from the standpoint of the cyber standpoint of if someone gets in, I got to make sure I get them out and keep them out so that we can be protected moving forwards. And then you've already talked about training and education as far as IT staff. I think the other component is our users because, quite frankly, from a CIO perspective, my biggest, scariest thing is I got 11,000 employees in the Highway Patrol. And all it takes is one to click on that link to introduce something into my network that then I have to deal with. And so always making sure that we're reminding our folks and training our folks of how to be good. And so when we look at preparing ourselves for cyber, we're working closely with our partner, and we're working to address the cyber threat. And from the CHP standpoint, our roles and responsibilities are very clear as far as being lead on the criminal investigation on those cases. And we're always asking ourselves what additional things do we need to ensure that we're ready for whatever comes in the future with changing technology and that we can respond appropriately when the state needs us.
All right. Well, thank you very much for all that good information. Do the members have any questions? All right. Mr. Obernolte.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I was actually fascinated by what you were talking about information sharing component, and specifically the example that you had where you detected some malware that was emailed to one inbox, and you were able to pull that email from 8 other inboxes before the user even was aware of it. But obviously the limitation of that is that you might have secured the CHP's email servers, but that email could have been spent to 1 million different people, and the other 900,000, were not protected. And I'm wondering if we're not falling a little short in addressing that problem by not fostering ways of sharing that information, because one sophisticated user could look at an email and say that is definitely phishing, and yet that information isn't shared to other organizations. I know some email service providers have people that look for emails like that, and they might stop the spread of an infection just for the users of that email service, but that doesn't help everybody. So I'm wondering, in your opinion, do you think that there's a government catalyst that's needed to foster a system of information sharing to prevent these attacks from occurring? And
I think when you look at the information sharing, that's exactly what the administration is really working on, of how do we expand that scope, because I think there's multiple layers to it from that standpoint. And in my example, we actually shared that information with the Department of Technology and the state email provider, so that information went beyond just the CHP, so that we could capture those things. There's also multi-state information sharing that goes on, and again, it's really pushing that out and trying to maximize, because I think you have a great point of how do we maximize it. And of course, one of the other challenges with a lot of our attacks is you look at the IP addresses or the domains they come from. The average time frame they're up, a day. Mm. And so it's one of those things that they're constantly changing, which is a challenge.
Sure, but I mean, in your example, you're talking about government information sharing between government agencies,
Correct.
Which is great if that was sent to a government email address. But what I'm referring to is maybe when someone has identified one of these malicious emails that everybody knows. As soon as somebody knows, everybody knows, and we can pull it out of the majority of email inboxes before it causes an infection to spread. But there's no system in place that I know of right now that is capable of doing that, and I wonder if industry needs a little bit of government pushing to get there.
And I think it's one of those things, and the challenge is identifying which ones do you pull and which ones do you don't with that. But it's definitely one of the advantages of information sharing. You're right.
Thank you.
Assemblymember Gordon.
Thank you to the two chairs. This may be more of a statement than a question. and that is that as I listen to this presentation and hear from these two state agencies, departments, offices, and I hear you talk about your partners, and you need to work with DOJ, and you got to talk to the technology folks. I'm struck with the fact that I keep trying to figure out who's really in charge, and how does this partnership work? So it seems to me that at some point one of the things we need to begin to give further thought about it. Have we got this organized in the right way? I mean, are there too many chefs in the kitchen? Bear with me, so we don't have the right recipe. But at any rate, that's more of a statement than a question.
Thank you. Mr.
Just a quick comment. And with public safety, obviously your systems have to be more secure than others, and that's one thing I think I've seen in public safety is that it's a higher standard. Am I accurate? Or am I off on that? Or?
Well, and I think it's one of those things that I think we're even more sensitive to the issue from the standpoint of being responsible for investigating it, also looking to make sure that we're being responsible as far as managing our systems. And it's one of those things, and I appreciated the earlier comment that it's a process from the standpoint of you have to continually look at your systems and identify what the threats are, and am I doing all I can to make sure that we have the best defense out there?
I have a quick question for Mr. Sumner. What can we do, or what can you do to encourage or require businesses to better secure their data?
So we are going to be actively evaluating different businesses and meeting with a number of members of the private sector over the next year, personally on behalf of our office, providing trainings and conducting compliance outreach. From a state perspective, I think that there has been a lot of focus on just the myriad of different laws and regulations that are available to review for a security assessment for private enterprise. I would definitely recommend continuing to look at those laws and finding a way to harmonize them in a way that is a little bit more coherent to the private sector. I think that especially when we talk about ways to perhaps provide a federal standard, it might make more sense to reapproach our state standards and harmonize them so that they are a little bit less cluttered or disjointed for businesses to interpret.
Thank you.
I had several more questions, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to hold off. But I want to take this opportunity to thank all three gentlemen for joining us today, and we'll be in touch with you. And thank you for all your good work.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we're going to hear from the Department of Technology. Joining us is Michelle Robinson, who is the State Chief Information Security Officer, or CISO, or CISO for short. Welcome, Ms. Robinson. And before you present your presentation, I'd like to pose a question. In fact, if you can help us guide the focus of the discussion on that question first, and then maybe you can incorporate the answer into your presentation. Now, we heard about the auditor's report, and it's my understanding that your department is responsible for ensuring state agencies to comply with information security requirements, and yet the audit that we have heard and seen reveals that your department was fully unaware, or at large, unaware of what's been going on as far as the deficiencies are concerned. And when your department was made aware of the deficiencies, and for the most part, your department failed to follow up. And just to recap some of the highlights or some of the key findings of the auditor, 5 out of 5 audited entities were found to be deficient, and 73 of 77 responding entities admitted that they were out of compliance, and that's 94%. And 37 of the 41 entities that self-reported were found to be deficient, and that's 90%. And 40% of the entities self-reporting that they were not in compliance in 2014, yet the department had no follow-up or process to follow up with them. And the audit also detailed a widespread misunderstanding of the requirements amongst the state agencies. And worse yet, the auditor's report says that the department's initial response to the finding as vague and lacking sufficient understanding. So the question that I have, if you can incorporate the answer into your presentation as we go along, is how could this happen? Let's start with that. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate the question. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. As the state's Chief Information Security Officer with policy and oversight responsibility for information security and privacy in state government, I very much appreciate the increased interest and concern for cybersecurity and welcome the opportunity to provide an update on our status and address your specific question, Mr. Chow. So protecting state information assets and data entrusted to our care is a top priority for us. We take the responsibility very seriously. California has actually made great strides in the past few years to improve information security and privacy in state government and overall across the state. In fact, I think California was recently recognized in a Pell Center report on one of only a handful of states that is taking innovative leadership and actions to address the myriad of cybersecurity complexities and challenges. Nonetheless, our work is far from done, and it will never be done. This is a continuing, dynamic, evolving challenge, and our work will never be done. So cybersecurity and continuous improvement are an ongoing effect by everyone, and we're committed to do continued diligence and focused attention on optimizing state government programs. I'd like to also take this opportunity, if I may, to personally thank the state auditor for her continued focus on this area. We appreciate the auditor's report and its recommendations for improvement. Of the auditor's 9 recommendations for us issued 6 months ago, we've either completed, partially completed, or completed those. And specifically, we've taken the following actions. We've updated our policies and directed state agencies in the use of standardized self-assessment tool and a standardized plan of action and milestones, which closely aligns with the security standards adopted by the state. Department plans of actions are now being reviewed, and they are to provide updates to us on a quarterly basis. I believe the auditor's recommendation was annually. We are going beyond that and are asking for progress so we can see a progression of progress and not waiting for a full year to receive that update. And this will allow us to better gauge continuous effort. We've provided a series of workshops, group trainings, and we also provide one-on-one supplemental guidance on the use of the tools. We continue to expand and refresh our security and privacy training in the department's training catalog, and as was mentioned earlier, we are looking for alternative ways to deliver the training. However, I must say, with respect to specifically the ISO basic training boot camp that we offer, which really those designated ISOs are the ones that really have to help their organizations effectively carry out risk management. And so we believe that that does require in-person training. We've updated the training to include some more practical hands-on application of the theory and material covered in that course, and we believe that's extremely important. The majority of state agencies are in the Sacramento area, and as an alternative, we're happy to go out to the few that may be remote and deliver the training in a one-on-one manner. Excuse me. In the first high-risk report, we did respond that resources were an issue. Subsequent to that, we did submit a budget change proposal and were successful in getting authorization to stand up a pilot audit program. We are in the tail end of the pilot program. We've audited 5 departments that are comprised of 3 large organizations were audited, 1 medium-sized and 1 small. We're in the process of engaging 3 more. Our audit team is prepared to implement more frequent and risk-based audits as recommended by the auditor. To achieve this, the governor's budget includes an increase of $1.6 million and 11 positions to expand the information security pilot program into a permanent audit function, and it will review all departments for compliance with information security requirements. I appreciate the auditor's statement about the importance of the way you pose a question, because I'd like to clarify a bit about, hang on, sorry. like to clarify a couple of the comments made. And the reason we're here with a pilot audit program and beginning to audit organizations is, one, self-certification without validation doesn't provide any real form of assurance that they are implementing the controls necessary. And the survey went out to departments and various representatives in those departments. I think that has something to do with the response as well, depending on who those were delivered to. But really, we're not going to truly understand the condition of each of these entities until we have gone in there and actually done an audit, whether it's our office or the state auditor or another entity. A couple of other comments were that we do not survey departments or outreach to them about the training, and we actually do that. And that's where I appreciate the comment about that maybe it's the way you phrase the question and how it might have been phrased to us in the audit process, because we actually do have survey results from both our governance meetings with departments and training. And in fact, the training survey results, 90% of the attendees say that they feel when they leave there, they're going to be more effective in their job. So happy to share those survey results, and apologize for any misunderstanding about the question and what was being asked for. So within 8 months of receiving authorization for the pilot, we actually developed that program and had its methodology independently evaluated in order to move forward with the audits that we're conducting right now. So in the short term, we've also updated our internal procedures for improved review, analysis, and follow-up with the departments to include comparisons of those self-assessments, audit reports, and the periodic request for supplemental documents in support of that. So rather than wait for our audit team to actually go out and be able to do a comprehensive audit of the department, we're doing some spot checking based on their compliance submissions, where if they say they have some policies and procedures in place, we're asking to see those and to do some sort of validation. Also, as an interim to the longer-term solution, department's use of the tools and process will permit us to identify trends and better measure progress. One of the challenges has been the lack of automation in my office. We are in the process of implementing a tool to first automate the incident reporting process. That tool that we have acquired will also, it's known as a governance, risk, and compliance platform. It will allow us to then implement an automated solution for better tracking of departments' reporting and compliance. It will fully integrate all aspects of our information security program and be able to provide us with more real-time data and data analytics. So we plan to implement this by the end of the year. Additionally, during the last 4 months, my office has facilitated nearly a dozen Assembly Bill 670 implementation meetings to reach consensus with partners at the Governor's Office of Emergency Service and the Department of Military on the prioritization index and risk assessment criteria for state entities. As with the number of 35 assessments called out in the adopted legislation, the core criteria established is a floor, not a ceiling. Our expectation is that departments continue to tailor the criteria to assess additional areas as determined through the risk framing process. And I have a diagram. I'll go over what that is in a little bit more detail at the onset of each engagement. Further, the established criteria aligns with our state-adopted standards as well as the critical controls that were mentioned in the Office of the Attorney General's report. We've priority ranked the departments, and over 50 state entities are required to be assessed this year. Our partners at the military are prepared to assist in the performance of these assessments, and state entities are being required to inform us of their assessor acquisition plan and the timeline for ensuring their assessments are completed this year. So assessment is a cyclical activity. We currently require state entities to conduct a comprehensive independent assessment at least once every 2 years and more frequently if changes in their environment warrant it. And there are a number of them who have been doing this. The goal of the assessment is to identify the information asset, which you heard is a really critical component to being able to secure those assets, is understanding what you have. Then secondly, the potential threats and risks to those, especially in the particular environment, and that can be different from one entity to another. So it's really important to understand what laws and regulations are they subject to, as well as what are the risks in their particular environment, so they can set those controls at an appropriate level. The standards that we've adopted here at the state are not federal standards, but they are developed by the National Standards of Institute and Technology, which sits under Department of Commerce, and they promote that interoperability and information exchange and flow of information across systems that is needed to sustain many government operations and economic viability.